The wind, a constant, rasping voice across the high plains, clawed at the rough timbers of the cabin, a sound Eleanor had come to know better than any human voice. 3 years. 3 years since the fever took Thomas, 3 years since the last wagon train passed, leaving her a solitary speck in this vast, indifferent ocean of prairie grass and sky. Loneliness was a physical weight, heavy in her chest, but resilience was a muscle she'd built with calloused hands and a flinty will. She mended fences alone, hunted rabbits and deer with a steady aim, and watched the horizon with eyes that saw not just the sun and stars, but the subtle shifts that signaled weather, or worse, unwelcome approach. Her cabin, small and sturdy, was more than shelter. It was a declaration, a tiny fortress built against the relentless elements and the predatory nature of a land still largely untamed by her kind. Every sunrise was a victory, every sunset a precarious peace earned through vigilance and sheer endurance. Fear was a familiar companion, a cold knot in her stomach, but she had learned to live beside it, to use its sharp edges to hone her senses, not paralyze her will. This morning, the fear flared, hot and immediate. 2 riders against the eastern horizon, large, silhouetted figures that were undeniably Comanche. They rode with a purposeful stride, not scouting, but coming towards her. Her hand instinctively went to the rifle propped near the door. Her mind raced through the sparse lessons of survival. Hide, fight, plead, but there was nowhere to hide that offered real concealment, and fighting 2 warriors was suicide. Pleading felt like a surrender of the dignity she clung to. She stood frozen for a long moment, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They were closer now, their powerful horses covering ground quickly. She could see the glint of sun on bare skin, the stark lines of their faces, the heavy braids. They pulled up maybe 50 yards from the cabin, halting their horses, observing her. They were immense men, broad-shouldered and tall, even-mounted. One, older perhaps, sat his horse with a quiet authority, his gaze steady and assessing. The other, younger, leaner but still powerfully built, shifted restlessly, his eyes sweeping over the cabin, the small corral, the neatly stacked firewood, a look that seemed to hold a volatile mix of curiosity and something sharper, harder, appraisal, perhaps, or something akin to resentment. It was the younger one who spoke first, a guttural word in Comanche, accompanied by a gesture towards his companion, who was slumped slightly in his saddle, one hand pressed to his side. Eleanor didn't understand the words, but the meaning was stark in the pained tension of the older man's posture and the urgency in the younger one's face. They needed help. Here, in her isolated world, the predators were seeking succor from the prey. The irony was a bitter taste. Her training, the ingrained distrust of her people towards theirs, screamed at her to retreat, to bar the door, to shoot if they came closer. But the sight of the older man's evident pain, the raw need in the younger's eyes, a look that momentarily stripped away the war paint and the formidable presence, stirred something complex within her. A flicker not of pity, but of recognition. They were beings in distress, just as she had been many times, alone under this unforgiving sky. The fear remained, a cold, heavy stone in her gut, but it was joined now by a bewildering uncertainty. What could she, a lone woman, possibly do? And what would be the cost of doing anything at all? The younger warrior spoke again, his voice rough, gesturing more emphatically towards his injured companion, and then towards the cabin door. The choice, she realized with a sinking heart, was no longer hers to simply evade. She lowered the rifle slowly, but did not put it away. Keeping her eyes fixed on them, she took a hesitant step forward, then another, towards the cabin door. It was a small concession, an opening, but it felt like stepping off a cliff edge. She pushed the door open wider, stepping back into the shadows of the small room, leaving the threshold open. It was a silent invitation, fraught with peril. The older warrior dismounted stiffly, pain etched on his features. The younger one dismounted with fluid grace, never taking his eyes off Eleanor. He seemed to hold a watchful tension, ready to react at the slightest sign of threat. He helped his companion dismount fully, supporting his weight. The older warrior stumbled, his breath catching in a sharp gasp. The younger man's grip on him tightened, his jaw setting. They were formidable even wounded, their sheer size and presence filling the small space between her and the door. The younger warrior glanced back at the older one, a flicker of concern. Then his gaze swept back to Eleanor, his eyes narrowed slightly. It was in that prolonged look that she sensed it most strongly from him, not outright hostility, but a deep-seated challenge, an unspoken question about her presence, her capability, perhaps even her right to exist in such isolation and apparent peace when their own lives were a constant struggle. It was the first unsettling hint of the envy the prompt had mentioned, a complex, wordless communication of disdain mixed with a grudging acknowledgement of her survival. The older warrior leaned heavily against the door frame, his eyes closed for a moment. The younger one spoke again, a short, sharp phrase, pointing towards the inside of the cabin. The message was clear. They were coming in. She stepped back further, into the center of the main room, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. They crossed the threshold, the younger warrior half carrying the older one, their buckskin and hides smelling faintly of smoke, horses, and something wild and untamed. The air in the cabin, usually smelling only of wood smoke, dried herbs, and her own quiet solitude, was suddenly thick with their presence, their heat, their raw vitality. The older warrior sank onto the small cot she used as a bed, groaning softly, his hand still pressed firmly to his side. A dark, spreading stain was visible on his tunic. He was bleeding and heavily. The younger warrior knelt beside him, speaking low and rapidly in Comanche, examining the wound. He looked up at Eleanor then, his expression grim. He pointed to the wound, then made a gesture of cutting, followed by a motion of kneading cloth and water. There was no arrogance in the request now, only grim necessity. The initial flash of challenge in his eyes had been replaced by a focused intensity. Eleanor moved stiffly, her mind starting to process the immediate need over the paralyzing fear. This was something concrete she could do. She fetched her basin, poured water from the bucket, and found clean lengths of linen she used for bandages. As she worked, moving carefully around the confined space, she felt the younger warrior's eyes on her, not with the earlier challenging gaze, but with a silent, assessing scrutiny. He watched her every movement as she heated water over the small fire, tore the linen into strips, and gathered her sparse medical supplies, dried yarrow for clotting, clean needles she used for mending. The older warrior, despite his pain, watched her too, his expression more weary acceptance than anything else. The younger warrior spoke again, a soft command to his companion, then rose. He moved towards the door, glancing out, his posture instantly alert, a sentinel safeguarding their vulnerable moment. He stood there, a silent, powerful guardian, his back to her, but she could feel the intensity of his watchfulness. It was an unspoken division of labor, a practical response to their shared predicament. She would tend to the injured, he would guard against the world outside. This unexpected, functional partnership, born of crisis, began to slowly chip away at the wall of her fear, replacing it with a different kind of tension, a fragile bridge of necessity built over a chasm of cultural mistrust and isolation. He remained by the door as she set about tending to the wound. The older warrior, whom the younger man referred to as Tavibo, though she only learned the name through repetition, not direct address, managed to shed his blood-soaked tunic with painful slowness, his breath hissing through his teeth. The wound was deep, a ragged cut on his lower side, likely from a blade rather than an arrow. It needed cleaning, staunching, and stitching if it wasn't to fester. Eleanor worked methodically, drawing on the limited knowledge she possessed, what her mother had taught her, what she'd learned through necessity in her 3 years alone. The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by Tavibo's pained breaths, the crackle of the fire, and the younger warrior's soft, intermittent movements by the door as he scanned the horizon. His name, she eventually gathered from his address to Tavibo, was Chaitin. Chaitin. His gaze, when it did turn towards her, held that same complex mix she had noticed earlier. It wasn't simple gratitude, nor was it purely suspicion. There was a sharp intelligence there, a quickness in his eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her cabin, her movements, her quiet determination. He saw her competence, her self-possession despite the terrifying circumstances, and she felt that earlier hint of envy again, a prickling sense that her independent existence here, in this harsh land where his people often struggled for survival and dominance, was something he found both perplexing and, perhaps, resented. Not the envy of wanting her possessions, but the envy of her apparent peace, her stable shelter, her detachment from the constant struggle for tribal survival. It was the envy of quiet sufficiency in a world of relentless conflict. He stood guard while she cleaned the wound carefully with heated water, the steam rising in the cool cabin air. Tvibo endured the pain with stoic silence, his eyes fixed on her face, a silent, assessing look that held no malice, only observation. She worked with a focused intensity that pushed the fear to the background. This was practical, immediate, a life needed tending. As she threaded the needle with strong sinew, Chayton turned from the door and approached the cot, his large frame casting a shadow over her work. He watched her hands as she began to stitch the wound, her movements precise and steady. He spoke then, his voice low and rough, a question she didn't understand. But his gesture towards the wound, then towards her, was clear. Was she sure? Could she do this? She met his gaze directly, a flicker of defiance rising within her. She couldn't understand his words, but she could understand the doubt. She nodded, her expression resolute. She had stitched her own cuts, mended her own torn skin. She would stitch his companion's wound. He studied her face for a long moment, that complex gaze searching hers. Then, slowly, he gave a short, sharp nod of acceptance. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a fragile thread of trust woven between them. The stitching was painstaking work. The skin was tough, the wound deep. Tvibo clenched his fists, but made no sound, only a slight tensing of his body. Eleanor focused entirely on her task, blocking out the immensity of the two men in her small space, the alienness of the situation, the lingering tendrils of fear. Chayton remained close by, watching, his presence a warm, solid weight at her side. It was strange, unsettlingly so, to have another human being so near after so long alone, especially one who should, by all the rules of her world, be an enemy. But in this moment, they were simply people confronting a shared crisis. The wound closed slowly under her careful needlework. She applied a poultice of chewed yarrow leaves she kept dried for such emergencies, securing it with the linen strips. When she was finished, she straightened up, her back aching, her hands smeared with blood. Tvibo looked exhausted, but the frantic edge of pain had lessened. Chayton knelt beside the cot, speaking softly to his companion, his voice gentler than she had heard it before. He then looked up at Eleanor. His gaze was still intense, but the sharp edge of challenge seemed to have softened slightly, replaced by a grudging respect. He gestured towards the wound, then made a small motion of acknowledgement towards her. It wasn't thanks, not in words she understood, but it was clear. The need had forged a temporary, unspoken alliance. The next few days were a strange, tense cohabitation. Tvibo rested on the cot, weak but slowly recovering. Chayton remained watchful, guarding, hunting small game nearby, rarely venturing far from the cabin. Eleanor went about her routines as best she could with two imposing strangers in her home. She cooked the food she had, sharing it with them, dry jerky, beans, cornmeal porridge. They ate sparingly, watching her. The language barrier remained, a wall between them, but necessity and shared space began to build unexpected bridges of understanding. Chayton observed her constantly. He watched her milk the cow, collect eggs from the hens, tend her small garden plot. He saw her competence, her quiet diligence, the way she handled herself with an economy of movement and a fierce independence. And she felt that envy from him still, a silent current beneath his watchful surface. It was in the way his eyes lingered on her possessions, simple things, but solid and permanent in a nomadic world. It was in the way he sometimes looked at her, healthy and whole, attending to his injured companion, while his own people faced sickness and death without such readily available aid. It was a complex envy of her settled life, her security, her apparent invulnerability to the constant threats he knew. It wasn't personal, not really. It was a reflection of the vast, irreconcilable differences in their ways of life, viewed through the lens of hardship. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Chayton, who was outside sharpening a knife, was instantly alert. He melted into the sparse cover near the cabin, signaling silence with a sharp gesture. Tvibbo, still weak, tensed on the cot. Eleanor froze. It was a lone rider, a white man, a trapper by the look of him, heading roughly towards her cabin. This was a different kind of threat. While Comanche rarely troubled her directly, drifters and desperate men of her own kind could be equally, if not more, dangerous to a lone woman. As the rider got closer, Chayton moved swiftly but silently, disappearing around the back of the cabin towards the small corral where her horse and their 2 ponies were kept. Eleanor understood. He was ensuring their horses weren't visible. He was, in his way, protecting their shared secret and perhaps protecting her from a potential threat from her own world, a threat he implicitly understood better than she did. The trapper reined in his horse outside the cabin, calling out. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway, rifle held loosely but visibly. The trapper's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, alone. He was burly, with a rough beard and wary eyes. He asked for water, for supplies, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. She kept her answers short, polite but firm. She had little to spare. As he pressed, becoming more insistent, a shadow shifted just at the edge of her vision, behind him. Chayton. He was standing silent, half hidden by the corner of the cabin, his presence a palpable warning. The trapper, sensing something unseen, something that shifted the balance of power, suddenly seemed eager to leave. He mumbled his thanks, backed his horse away, and rode off, casting nervous glances back. Eleanor remained in the doorway until he was a distant speck. When she turned back inside, Chayton was already resuming his watch by the door, his expression unreadable. Neither of them spoke about it, but the incident had reinforced the strange, protective dynamic that had developed. He, the outsider, the potential threat, had stood guard against a threat from her own world. The layers of fear and mistrust were slowly, painstakingly peeling away, revealing the shared vulnerability that lay beneath. It was a fragile, temporary peace, built on the understanding that in this harsh land, survival sometimes demanded unlikely alliances. Tvibbo was strong enough to travel by the end of the week. He could move without assistance, though still favoring his side. The wound, thanks to Eleanor's care, was clean and healing well. On the morning of their departure, the cabin felt charged with unspoken significance. Chayton watched Tvibbo mount his horse, his gaze still sharp, but the hard edge that had held the envy seemed less pronounced now, perhaps replaced by the simple fact of his companion's recovery, a more immediate concern that transcended cultural differences. As Tvibbo settled onto his pony, he looked down at Eleanor, who stood a respectful distance from them. He spoke a few words in Comanche, his voice low. She didn't understand the meaning, but his expression held a quiet dignity, a look that was perhaps a form of gratitude. Then he turned his horse and began to ride away, a tall, straight figure against the vast canvas of the prairie. Chayton remained for a moment. He met Eleanor's gaze directly. The intensity was still there, the awareness, but the challenging glint was gone. He looked not with envy now, but with a profound, silent observation. He saw her resilience, the strength that was not physical dominance but quiet, unyielding persistence. He saw her small, sturdy cabin, not just as a structure, but as a testament to her will to survive, alone, against all odds. He made a gesture then, unlike any she had seen before. He placed his right hand over his heart, then extended it towards her, palm flat. It wasn't a wave or a thank you, but something older, more fundamental, a sign of respect, perhaps an acknowledgement of a shared space, a shared moment of vulnerability and aid that transcended the boundaries of tribe and history. Eleanor, uncertain but understanding the intent, instinctively mirrored the gesture, placing her hand over her own heart. Chayton held her gaze for a moment longer, a flicker of something she couldn't name passing across his features, not envy, perhaps a recognition of a kindred spirit in resilience, a fellow survivor in a world that gave no quarter. Then, with a final, silent nod, he turned his pony and loped away, joining Tvibo on the horizon. Eleanor watched them go until they were lost in the shimmer of the heat haze. The silence of the cabin settled back around her, vast and deep, but it was a different silence now. The fear that had been her constant companion for 3 years had not vanished entirely, but its grip had loosened. The encounter had been terrifying, uncertain, fraught with potential disaster. But it had also been human. It had been about pain and healing, and a shared need for safety that had momentarily erased the lines drawn by conflict and prejudice. She was still alone, yes. The cabin was still small, the prairie still vast and indifferent. But she no longer felt entirely like a solitary speck. The world, in that short, intense span of days, had expanded and contracted, revealing both its dangers and its unexpected capacities for connection. The complex envy she had sensed from Chayton lingered as a memory, a reminder of the stark differences in their lives, but it no longer felt like a personal threat. It was part of the larger, challenging reality of this land. She had faced fear, faced the unknown, and she had acted not out of bravado, but out of a quiet, ingrained humanity. She had stitched a wound, offered shelter, and in doing so, had stitched herself more firmly into the fabric of her own life, reaffirming her strength not just to endure, but to be. The sun was higher now, warming the cabin. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and walked back inside, towards the familiar rhythm of her solitary life. A life forever changed, subtly but undeniably, by the passage of 2 powerful, wounded men and the quiet, resilient woman who had helped them survive. She had not just survived their arrival. She had, in facing them, become more fully herself.